Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, distinguished guests. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you to tonight's CILE public lecture, which is entitled Necessary Migrant Labour Reform, Islamic Ethics, Human Rights or Market Economics. We have a very distinguished panel this evening, but before I introduce them and say a few words, I would just like to invite our director, the CILE director, Dr. Tariq Ramadan, just to say a few words, please.
Thank you. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Just a few words. I really want to thank Professor Reda for organizing this event in the name of CILE. It's one of our fields that we are tackling this evening about migrations and human rights. Let me just say a few words as an introduction, welcoming you this evening, because we have this public lecture while we also have a seminar dealing with the issue of migrant workers, and we have been working yesterday, today, and we will have our final day tomorrow with the scholars of the texts and the scholars also of the context, the people who knows about the issue. What we want to do, and this is something that we decided from the very beginning, is when it comes to ethics and when it comes to our Islamic reference, we want within the center, the research center, to tackle all the issues and to ask all the questions that should be asked on any topic. And this is also something which we know that this is a very sensitive topic. The way we want to tackle this is to try to get the right questions and also the right answers as first steps from an Islamic perspective, knowing that that this is an international issue. When we speak about migrant workers or refugees today or all this situation and human rights, we are talking about something that is universal. It's everywhere on earth. No country can lecture another country on that. If we look at the situation in Europe, we look at the situation here in the region, and we should avoid any state of denial. There are problems. There are things that are not acceptable and things that should be reformed everywhere. No country just say, we get it all. So let us come to a critical discussion, which at the same time, and this is the way we were tackling the issue, it's critical, but it's constructive. It's not to be critical for the sake of being critical, and we are happy because we are saying something about one country and not others. No selection, no double standards, but critical and constructive at the same time. This is what we are trying to do in the center. We want to base and to rely on facts and figures and minds that are helping us to reform the situation. Knowing also that we are not only dealing with migrants, it's a very complex issue. We are dealing with religions and religious principles, yes, because we want to come to something which has to do with what are our ethical principles. If you are a Christian, a Jew, a Buddhist, a Hinduist, a Muslim, an atheist, an agnostic, there is an ethical issue here. And we have to come to this critical discussion about where do we stand with our values when we see day in, day out that these values are contradicted by the way people are dealing with migrants or refugees. So the question about human rights, it's important, but we have to be comprehensive in our approach. We should not only speak about states, we should speak about, as we did today, transnational cooperation. We are not only dealing, we also have to deal with people. It's very important also to start about education, because a great deal has to do with the way we are looking at people, the way we have a perception that some human beings are more human than others. That we are dealing with racism, we are dealing with xenophobia, we are dealing with cultural prejudices, we are dealing also with economic status. If you have some money, you are much more welcome than if you don't. So it has to do also with class. It's a very complex issue. So the first, and this is what we will see this evening, the first step is not to oversimplify and to make it a politicized discussion to target some countries, but a critical discussion to reform what is happening into the countries. That's the way we are looking at it. This is the way we want to be involved in it. And this is why this evening we are touching a very sensitive issues, but all the questions are welcome as long as you put them in a constructive way and not for the sake of being critical and not getting our point, an academic discussion to find solutions. Thank you and good evening, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, on the panel of scholars that we have this evening, in order of talk, I will say a few things myself, take some liberty as the moderator. Dr. Latife Reda, who teaches philosophy, political philosophy at the Lebanese American University in Beirut and a consultant to the International Labour Organization. Dr. Jawad Syed, Professor of Organizational Behavior and Diversity Management at the Business School of the University of Huddersfield in England. Mr. Jabir Howaiel, who is the Director of Legal Affairs at the National Human Rights Committee in Qatar. Very pleased to have you here. And lastly, Dr. Sheikh Ali Al-Qaradaghi will be the last speaker. He is the Professor of Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence at Qatar University and the Secretary General of the International Union of Muslim Scholars. The panelists will have about 10 minutes or so each to address the issues concerning migrant labour in Gulf countries from the perspective of Islamic law, history and tradition. The criticism of some of the laws excuse me, and practices governing foreign labour, particularly low-skilled workers, will be addressed in relation to whether they comply with Islamic principles of ethics and legislation. The question being posed asks, what should take precedence? Islamic principles of ethics, United Nations principles of human rights, or secular profit-oriented economics? The topic asks what legislative and behavioural reforms are necessary to address those practices that do not comply with Islamic principles and human rights. How will migrant workers benefit, but also how will the Gulf states and their citizens benefit from such reforms? These are ongoing and controversial issues that affect us all, but issues that CILE insists that we should not shy away from, but rather to discuss openly and truthfully, and where necessary to seek radical reform of those practices which we deem to be unacceptable by Sharia principles as well as international and universal moral standards. The migrant worker reforms in Qatar that were proposed over a year ago by the Qatari authorities have been passed last week by the Cabinet, but still require His Highness the Emir's signature. They will be given another year to be implemented or complied with, that is, to the end of 2016. The principal reforms, as I understand them from the 2014 statement to the United Nations Human Rights Council, are, firstly, that the kafala system will take sponsorship out of the hands of private individual citizens. The sponsor will be the state, and employment relations will be based more upon the employment contract. There is no elaboration so far on how this might differ with existing employment contracts, other than the suggestion that there will be a standardised contract. Secondly, all employers will be required to pay wages through a bank transfer. This will provide an official record of whether the wages are being paid and paid properly in terms of the amount and whether on time. This is a fundamental requirement of Islamic law. Such wage issues are the major complaints of workers, in fact, in Qatar. But the bank transfer may not reveal possible deductions from the basic wage and overtime pay unless a detailed pay slip is included and reconciled with the contract. This needs to be addressed. Thirdly, the exit visa requirement will be abolished, but employees leaving the country must provide 72 hours notice. This will give time for employers to object and request a travel ban. For this, they must provide a valid reason, which will require a proper and prompt judicial review with conciliation and arbitration procedures. Fourthly, the no objection certificates that are currently required from a sponsor if a person wants to change employers in Qatar. The new provision will allow workers to change employers without permission at the end of their contract period. If the contract is indeterminate, has an indeterminate period, it will be after 5 years of employment. I've predicted that this will mean that employers may begin to demand contracts with longer periods than the normal 1 or 2 years. And in anticipation, we are already observing new contracts and contract renewals being increased to 3 years. Fifthly, currently, if an employee finishes a contract and returns home, he or she still needs a no objection certificate if wanting to return to Qatar to another employer. Without that, they cannot return to the country for 2 years. That period will be reduced to 6 months. Now, I don't know if what has been passed last week will be precisely these original proposals, because the full text of the draft law has not been released. But it is clear that there is a political will in Qatar to institute reforms in relation to foreign workers within the state. Now, while this forum is more directed at migrant workers in the Gulf states, we cannot ignore another type of migration, namely forced migration of displaced people due to war and conflict who are desperately seeking asylum and protection as refugees, as was discussed in our seminar earlier today. I speak specifically about Syrian refugees who have fled to neighbouring countries, but also increasingly to Europe. Now, it's not necessary to go through chapter and verse of Islamic commitments to refugees. It is perfectly clear that Islam requires believers to assist and protect vulnerable people, whether Muslim or non-Muslim. The Hijrah itself provides an understanding and empathy for what it is like to be persecuted and need to travel to safety, to a place where one can live with protection and sustenance to practice one's religion and culture. I want to quote a succinct statement from an article published in a Canadian newspaper last Thursday. The story behind last week's haunting images of refugees in Europe does not begin with the body of a little boy on a beach in Turkey. The United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has been reporting for years that people are fleeing violence in rapidly increasing numbers. It is reported in June last year that 42,500 people fled their homes every day. Half were children. Camps are overflowing. Dangerous boats are more crowded than ever. Bodies are appearing stacked in abandoned trucks and washed up on the beaches. Incredibly, many governments around the world responded by erecting fences, shutting down transit routes, putting people in detention, and poisoning the response of their own citizens by claiming that these desperate families are queue jumpers or terrorists. Unquote. To focus upon Syrians, whether Muslim, Christian, Palestinian, Kurd, or other, ordinary people, civilians, families, children, are caught between the brutality of the Syrian government forces as well as Daesh and other rebel forces battling it out. It quickly became intolerable and unlivable. Islam obliges its followers to flee from such conditions to safety to seek a better life. The reason for the tragedies we are witnessing is because of borders of nation states that not everyone can enter. Human migration has not been liberalised under capitalism, as have products, services and finance. It has been the opposite, and more so with the rise of anti-immigration or xenophobic or racist nationalism in Europe and elsewhere that is both on the right and the left of politics. Migration is still fettered by the principles of state sovereignty and the right of states to determine who is allowed to enter their country. In some cases, also who is allowed to exit. As the British author George Orwell once said, nationalism simply means thinking that you're better than other people. The horrendous scenes we've been witnessing on the television news of Hungary, for example, where refugees are placed in a caged area and food thrown at them as though they were animals. Or the Hungarian press photographer kicking a child and tripping over a refugee man who was running with a baby in his arms. And statements by Poland that they do not want Muslims in their country. And the list goes on. At the same time, it is a relief to see that Germany and Sweden have been far more welcoming.
In very high volume from the headset, and from the headset is feeding back to the microphone. Need to
the UNHCR,
the volume of the headphone from the presenter.
There's something.
This mic should be turned off. This is all the sound is.
The UNHCR figures for the Syrian refugees that were published on the 4th of September 2015, that more than 11 million Syrians have been displaced, 7 million internally, and the overwhelming majority are Sunni Muslims. Turkey has about 1.9 million, Lebanon about 1.2 million, which is more than a quarter of its population, Iraq 250,000, Jordan 630,000, Egypt 130,000. These are registered refugees, so the numbers are probably much higher. And these countries are collectively taking the bulk of the Syrian refugee population and are now feeling the burden. Some 320,000 have fled to Europe, and there are, of course, many more from sub-Saharan and northern Africa. The United States has taken 1,519, although they have now promised about 10,000 Syrian refugees will be resettled there, and other countries are beginning to soften. The Gulf states have paid hundreds of millions of dollars to equip and maintain Syrian refugee camps in the neighbouring countries. Yet there have been mounting questions and criticisms that the rich Gulf states should be doing more. In particular, they should be taking refugees, not just funding them, that they are wealthy and they need labour, so why not? Saudi Arabia has argued that there are some 500,000 Syrians in the kingdom. The UAE says it has taken 160,000 Syrians since 2011. But it's not clear if the Syrians who were accepted as whether these Syrians were accepted as refugees and resettled in accordance with the UNHCR conventions. The reasons articulated by the Gulf states for not taking Syrian refugees include the fear of potential political, ethnic and sectarian conflict. They are concerned that they would not know whether the Syrians are fleeing ISIS or whether they're fleeing Assad's bombs. Is this a legitimate concern for the vast majority of Syrian refugees? It is true that sectarian difficulties have surfaced in Lebanon and Turkey, but over the past 3 years, they don't seem to have had any particularly serious repercussions. In Egypt, which initially welcomed Syrians, stopped issuing them visas, and if a Syrian refugee leaves the country for any reason, they will not be permitted to return. One of our colleagues here has been unable to see his parents for 3 years since they became refugees in Cairo. On the other hand, perhaps Syrians do not see the Gulf states as welcoming. There's no tradition of taking large numbers of refugees, and therefore do not want to come here. They may not feel that the Gulf offers the kinds of opportunities that exist in Europe, so they risk their lives trying to get there, and with the knowledge that many thousands simply do not make it. Blame is directed at the Gulf states as well as the United States for waging war in Syria against the Assad regime, but not taking refugees who were created. The Gulf states argue that Iran and Russia are to blame for supporting Assad and also refusing to resettle refugees. Another argument has suggested that the United States did not intervene enough against Assad because they did not want to jeopardize the nuclear talks with Iran. The hapless Syrian civilians are simply caught in between. Is politics undermining our humanitarian hearts? A Kuwaiti television commentator recently argued that Kuwait was too expensive for refugees, but more appropriate for labourers. I'm not quite sure what he meant by that, other than it is a country for workers rather than refugees who need assistance. Or perhaps he meant that each refugee would require a sponsor or kafil. But more surprisingly, however, he went on to say, and I quote, "You can't, excuse me, you can't welcome people from another environment and another place who have psychological or nervous system problems or trauma and enter them into societies." Well, yes, this may be true. Around 5% of any large population is going to have some so-called mental health problems. But I would argue that this is not a reason for rejecting fellow Muslims. On the contrary, it's a reason for helping them. This is not to say that the Gulf states have not taken in refugees in the past, including Palestinians, Lebanese, Yemenis, and Kuwaitis when they were in trouble. Kuwait recently granted 120,000 Syrians there with long-term residency permits. But Syria also took in Palestinians who are now displaced once again, as well as Lebanese and Iraqis when they were displaced by war. The question is, can we find better ways to assist with what is now the largest refugee crisis in modern history? Well, my apologies, I've exploited my role as the moderator and I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening to me. I now have the honour of introducing our first speaker, Dr. Latife Reda. Thank you very much.
I'm going to be very briefly talking about the concepts of migration and labor in relation to Islamic principles. Then I'm going to move on to discuss one of the few gaps in the contemporary labor law, and also discuss them in relation to the principles of Islamic law, and then I will move on to just briefly talk about the benefits of reform, or one way in which we can benefit from reform. The ethics surrounding the concepts and practices of migration and labor are deeply rooted in the Islamic sources of the law, in the Quran and the Hadith, as well as in the modern forms of constitutionalism already in place in our region. These ethical debates surrounding these two concepts, migration and labor, have been picked up by Islamic scholars, reformists, and social theorists throughout history. They are both exalted activities in the sources and relate to the most traditional and also to the most contemporary or recent reinterpretations of principles of Islamic law or maqasid al-Sharia. And this is because issues of migration and labor have a direct impact on the welfare, the well-being, and the livelihoods of human beings, and as such are in line with the principles, with the maqasid, with the necessities within the maqasid, and are also directly related to the purpose, the general purpose of fulfilling the principles, which is promoting public welfare, public good, or maslahat al-amma. Today, in the Arab world, unfortunately, workers, and especially migrant workers, low-skilled workers, are not always treated according to modern forms of constitutionalism that we have endorsed, and also to Islamic codes of ethics and life in general. There are two important elements of migration in the Islamic tradition of hijrah that derive from the experiences of with migration of the first community of Muslims led by the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. The first one is the concept of oppression as well, very important concept in the tradition. And the second one is the idea of solidarity or the idea of brotherhood. When it comes to oppression, As we know, there are the events that surrounded the first migrations in the tradition were marked by different forms of oppression suffered by the first community of Muslims, and these forms of oppression include violence, coercion, persecution, and also included economic boycott, social alienation, intimidation, and isolation. Oppression then is another very important social element and central theme in the history of Islam and in the sources. And as a result, Islam commands, as Dr. Rey said before, that people must migrate from places where they're either forced to commit acts of wrongdoing or oppression, or are victims of oppression themselves. And as such, fighting oppression or resisting oppression or being subject to oppression is a defining factor of Islamic justice. The second one is the concept of solidarity, the second dimension that gives the ethical value of migration in the Islamic tradition is solidarity or brotherhood. As hijrah or migration at the time of the Prophet and the first Islamic community was marked by this pledge of solidarity between the migrants, the muhajirun, who were the first Islamic community, formed the first Islamic community, and the Ansar, who were the receiving community and the inhabitants of Medina and supporters of the Prophet. Both Muhajirun and Ansar, the receiving community and the migrant community, are mentioned extensively in the sources. Both migrants and receiving community established economic relations based on collaboration and cooperation, and this is an essential part of tradition of modern reinterpretations of maqasid when it comes to protection of wealth and protection of life, facilitation through generosity and through social cooperation. The pact was also important in ethical terms because it was not based on ethnicity, color, race, language, or tribal allegiance, because Islam came to set aside these kinds of these denominations in order to unite people under a more comprehensive spectrum. And as a matter of fact, the teachings of the first migrations, especially the one to Abyssinia, the smaller move to Abyssinia before the move to Medina, the larger one, which was also provoked by persecution, can also be seen as an act of facilitation and has set the moral basis of relations of Muslims, between Muslims and non-Muslims, and have supported the idea of freedom of religion on the basis of mere humanity, which is advanced by Islam. When it comes to labor and workers' rights in the Islamic tradition, very briefly, I would like to mention that there are fundamental principles that guide employment relations, the protection of workers, the rights of decent living and working conditions for all peoples, all workers, equal work for equal pay, and timely payment, among other rights. Although they have not been regulated in the formal practice of Islamic jurisprudence. And this is because work and labor has traditionally been seen as an honorable activity after the advent of Islam, because this idea came to challenge previous perceptions, negative perceptions on hard labor in the pre-Islamic, or among the pre-Islamic community. Islamic doctrines also have recognized the importance of equality in human relations, and obviously they apply to labor, whether they do it directly or indirectly. The principle of equality also applies to this kind of relationship. In the contemporary Arab world, most migration often happens on the basis of work. Migrants can be motivated, people can be motivated to migrate for many reasons, and often, as you were mentioning before, refugees also comprise a type of, make up a type of migrants. And if we look at the motivations for migration in terms of a broader understanding of oppression, which also includes economic deprivation, then we can include migrants, we can consider migrants as mainly being workers, and also when they are escaping violence or conflict and harsh circumstances, they they can be blended into the same category when we take into consideration the idea or the variable of oppression. Also, when it comes, they can be united in the sense that in the same conception of migration, of migrant, of what is a migrant, when work comes into the picture, because refugees, although work will not be seeking job opportunities, will not be the main motivation behind their migration, they're forced to seek a way to earn a livelihood in the host country, whether they do it temporarily, permanently, whether they do it formally or informally, legally, or in any way. Labor is also part of the definition of a refugee. And it's essential for because it is essential for his livelihood. In our region, many migrants are skilled, some are, but we have many low skilled workers in the region, and there is a particular problem with domestic workers, for instance, in the Arab countries and similar categories. And they are especially vulnerable because they are not included. They're actually excluded from the labor codes in GCC countries and in countries like Lebanon and Jordan. And I'm going to move to the recommendations, which are interrelated. And the first one is linked to this gap in the law, this exclusion of migrant workers from the labor codes, the fact that they are not recognized as workers under the law. And obviously, the first step for reform would be to acknowledge that that migrant workers are workers, and make them protect them through the law, because this will lead also to filling other gaps in the legislation when it comes to migrant workers, such as, for example, being included in the, being affected or included in social security schemes, or being affected by changes in raises in minimum salaries through ministerial decrees, for example, and other benefits. So first step would be to include them in the labor code. The second one, which is related to the first one as well, is obviously accompanying legal reform with proper practices, effective enforcement, increasing inspection mechanisms, increasing surveillance over the practices of employers, creating institutions to increase awareness of the law and of the rights by both sides, employer and employee, companies, etc. And finally, the third point would be that priority should be given to legal reform instead of only relying on bilateral agreements, which is often what is used to fill the gap, in the regulation of labor relationships when it comes to domestic workers and similar categories of workers. And the formalization of employment relationships between employer and migrant worker must be a process that should be the duty of the host country or the country of destination. And governments of migrant workers, countries of origin, for example, have the responsibility to protect their rights, their citizens abroad. But if we're talking about reform in our region and in our countries, then we have to acknowledge the responsibility of the government to change the law and to comply with good practices. And in order to avoid, for example, the fact that some people get paid for similar types of work or the same type of work, different salaries according to their nationalities, and this is often a result of these bilateral agreements. Finally, I'm just going to very briefly talk about how we can benefit from reform. I think in this sense, there are many things that we can say, but I'm going to focus on one specific aspect, which is that obviously promoting principles of equality, non-discrimination, decent living conditions, decent wages, timely payment, etc., would advance in general human development. And countries obviously can benefit, our countries can benefit in terms of human development, which is another a modern concept developed by economists. and has been suggested by contemporary Islamic scholars, for example, to be a more comprehensive expression of maslaha or general welfare according to Islamic principles. Human development rates are actually low in Muslim countries. Gulf countries and African countries, for example, show the lowest levels of human development. And it's ironic, especially when we find low levels of human development in places that have the highest rates of economic growth, or very high rates, comparable rates of economic growth in the region. Human development includes indicators such as decent standard of living, employment, gender equality, among other issues, among other indicators. So better treatment of workers under the law, better practices can lead to higher levels of human development. I just want to very quickly also mention that in another way, the community or the country, the governments, the people or individuals, all the individuals that have an interest in reform can benefit in spiritual ways as well, in the growth of the spiritual collective consciousness. And as such, growing in consciousness, for example, or doing what is doing what is right, and fulfilling the duty of preserving life and preserving the soul by doing the right thing, should also be part of human development of the host community. So human development can benefit migrant workers, can benefit the community in the sense that they can preserve a basic principle in our legacy.
Thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the power of the press has intervened and requested that Dr. Qaradaghi speak next. So, thank you very much.
In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, may the peace and blessings of God be upon his prophets and his companions and all those who follow him until the day of judgment. Brothers, sisters, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you with the welcome of Islam, and this welcome is Assalamu alaikum. May the peace of God be upon you all. I think that this kind of welcome takes within it and expresses within it a comprehensive word that aims to achieve peace in all human beings living on this earth. All human beings should aim to achieve safety and security for others as he or she wishes it for himself. You would not be a believer unless you love to have what you love to others, or unless you love to others what you love to have. And we do start with the salam every day. We do practice it. We do use it in our worship, in our ways of worship. And humanity enjoys one kind of safety and security. And this earth, planet Earth, is not owned by one category of people, but it is owned by everybody. As God says in Ar-Rahman, says that the earth was displayed, made for all creatures, all human beings, not to one particular category of people. That is why it is not allowed that one category of people to wage war to another people, or to harm another people, or to oppress another category of people. And from that standpoint, the Islamic divine Sharia came, which emanates from the good disposition and tries to underline a very important value, which is the value of justice and putting an end to oppression. Some people would be surprised, and God has made the reference of association with God is injustice. So those who associate with God are those who resort to a reference, a code of reference, which is based on injustice, which is based on oppression. God does not punish disbelievers because they are disbelievers. He imposes his wrath because there is injustice and there is oppression. The different Quranic verses have links between oppression and wrath. That is why I really liked a word by some of our religious Maliki scholars who said, when I read at great length in the Quran and in the Sunnah, I found that there are always exceptions, and I tried with all efforts to find an exception for justice, but there is no exception for justice. Justice is absolute, but any other principle, you would find exceptions. Except for justice, there is no exceptions in justice, because through justice, humanity can prevail, civilizations can prevail, and everything can be achieved. Our topic tonight, this is how we can start it. What is taking place in the world, in the GCC, in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, in the world at large. The main problem that we are facing is oppression, injustices practiced by the rulers against their own people, or by one category of society against another category of society, by one state against another society or state. Even the problems betwixt the different countries are because of the prevalence of injustices. And our topic today aims to set reforms to the rules and regulations of migration based on the different human rights and also world economy. And here we would like to talk very briefly about two main migrations. Each one of them is very important indeed. The first migration is the migration of the friends and followers of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to Abyssinia, to a ruler, a just ruler, as Prophet Muhammad has said. This is a ruler that is never unjust to people. In my view, and in my own interpretation of this hijrah, or this migration, this is a migration that shows the humanity of justice. The humanity of justice aims to contain other people, and such kind of value makes you choose this just person over another person. Prophet Muhammad preferred this just disbeliever ruler over his own uncle. So there is justice in Abyssinia, and this is a kind of a human feature that links people and makes them able to live together. And I've seen in some books, Quraysh has been very much inimical to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and they faced a huge hunger. Prophet Muhammad sent the Quraysh 500 dinars at the time. That was a fortune at the time. So 500 dinars of gold. Each dinar is 4.5 grams. That's a lot of money that was sent by Prophet Muhammad during the hunger time. So, and starvation. So the second hijrah or migration is the migration of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that has a different dimension altogether. If we look at the Ansar, they haven't lived a great deal with Islam as our parents and grandparents and other Muslims. They only lived in the era of Islam for a year or a year and a half, and God said that they were able, the men who stayed in their own city Medina and embraced Islam before them, loved those who have sought refuge with them. So these people, they helped the others, and they embraced Islam and loved those who sought refuge with them. They do not covet what they are given, but rather prefer their brothers and sisters above themselves, although they are in need. Those who protect themselves from their own greed shall surely prosper. So this is very important indeed. Your brothers, when you see them in need, you have to help them. Now we see workers working for us, domestic workers working, helping the housewives at home. But there is no appreciation. There isn't love dedicated to those people. Yes, there is a difference, but this is very important. This human trait and aspect is very important indeed. This topic should be solved, in my opinion, from different dimensions, from different angles. We have to look at it from a practical perspective. We have to try to instill and reinstill these principles. In the past, we used to accuse the West, saying that they have a kind of a spiritual void or vacuum. But let me tell you today, even Muslims today are facing a kind of a division between ethics, morals, and great values, and between their behavior and the things they do. And people are judged by the acts that they commit. So you have to give alms, you have to give zakat, you have to give charity, because it purifies the soul. These are very important principles. These are principles that we should implement and instill. And amongst the most important principles is ihsan, benevolence, which is very important indeed. You have to try to support your brother in humanity. This is a brother to you in humanity. You both came from Adam and Eve. You both come from the soil, from the ground, from dust. So we are all uterine brothers in humanity. And you have to fear God. And when we talk about uterine brotherhood or uterine brotherhood, it is the brotherhood of humanity. These are all our relatives. We are all from one race. Nobody is better than the other, unless it is a division through pious and hard work. Even Jews, even pagans should be treated in the same way, as long as they don't mistreat you, because they have been ensouled by God. That is why you have to treat them as brothers in humanity. Also, the concept of harmony, cooperation, that is imposed by God. We have to be good to human beings and animals. One of the women in the past, she was sent to hell because very much harmful to a cat. And another lady, she went to heaven because she was granted heaven because she gave water to a dog. And these are in authentic prophetic tradition. So we have to uphold these principles. We cannot say that this is not my brother because he is not of the same nationality. The countries of the GCC have been blessed by a wealth, but we have to tell you that times change. As it was said in the newspapers, there was a person in Kuwait. He used to respect a small child who used to work for him. And his wife was scared, thinking that maybe this is his son, and he was married to another wife, and and this is his son. He said, no, no, we were poor 50 years ago, and I went to Kerala, and I used to work for this person in Kerala. And because I was an Arab, he was treating me very nicely, and his son, now I'm taking care of him. I realized afterwards, after I started taking care of this boy, I realized that I was working for his own father. We should not try to boast our money and our wealth. We have to boast our values, our principles, how committed you are to these principles and ethics.
Islam, as a matter of fact, in addition to the objectives of Sharia, the lady has talked about, and our dear brother Rai, the state ought to organize the relationship with the individuals. In the Gulf states, most of the contracts are to do with the private sector, and most of the problems, unfortunately, take place in the private sector. And indeed, it relates to the domestic workers, and it touches upon the sisters, our sisters who are housewives. 90% of the problems occur between the housewives and the maids, and 10% otherwise. So the government ought to take care of this issue. The state of Qatar has its own regulations, and it organizes the matter to a certain extent. We need an improvement in this regard so that the values, the Islamic values, can be entrenched in the society. This is a Sharia call, but grace be to God, in 2014 we had a law, and God willing we need further laws, and there was another law in the past. I think that the leadership in Qatar is keen on pursuing this issue. Our master Umar, peace be upon him, or may God please him, he would allocate a certain share when he would distribute the wealth. He would say, for example, the man, in accordance with his need, if he works, we need to give him a certain amount of money. 1,000 riyal, for example, in this country cannot be good enough. We need to look at the wages, and if a man works further and works more than another, he needs to get a better salary. And all this ought to be taken into consideration, and the government ought to organize these issues in accordance with the laws. The state sometimes ought to interfere through funneling certain money from its own coffers, as Omar has done when he saw some people who used to be working. He found a Jew who was a beggar. He said, how come you become a beggar? He said that I'm an elderly man and I used to work. So Omar was surprised, and he said, by God, we haven't been fair to you. He said, how long did you work for? He said, 50 years. He said, 50 years you worked for us? That means we need to give you some money, perhaps a retirement money, because we were unfair to you. You can't become a beggar. I would say that the Arab and Muslim countries ought to take care of those who service them for long. They participated in the building of these countries. We need to be loyal. We can't be following the path of infidelity. We need to take care of these people. As a matter of fact, the contracts in accordance with Islam need to be judicious and wise. I have a research in this matter. 50,000 contracts have been categorized in accordance with the Islamic Sharia, and most of them, indeed, they are scaled up properly. God says, and we have revealed the kitab, the book, and the scale, and every scale has two parts, and on one part or on one there are rights and duties. So if there is a violation, then the contract will be void. Usury is wrong and it is impermissible. The two parties might be satisfied with paying usury, but both of them are damned because they violated this scale. Indeed, there is a rule that relates to abolishing the usury. So the scale will be tipped, and indeed oppression and haram or impermissible acts will be surfacing. So oppression is the bottom line here. The Quran used a very splendid term when he explained the transactions. He talked about reconciliation. The trade ought to be with the satisfaction of the two parties. Al-Baydawi said reconciliation or being satisfied means that the duties ought to be carried out as well as the rights ought to be obtained. So both parties ought to be co-equal. When Islam talks about the relationship between the people and the government, it uses the other formula because the volition of the people. The Quran said God has been pleased with the believers as they take the oath of allegiance. So that means the people are more powerful and they tip the scale if we compare it to one person. So these principles are very important. When it comes to the human rights, this is a very important issue, and most of the contemporary scholars, when they have scrutinized the human rights that was adopted by the Western countries and the Islamic countries, we indeed discovered that it was in Islam 1400 years ago. And as Dr. Muhammad al-Zuhaili has said, this is our creed. The moral aspect, the ethical aspect is our main pursue, and the human rights issues are very important, like the freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, the right to labor, the right of work, the right of education, and these are part and parcel of our creed, as well as the objectives of Sharia. The objectives of Sharia have organized these matters, and the objectives of Sharia are to do with the protection of the religion, the reason, the wealth, the progeny of Islam, as well of humans, as well as security, and to stave off corruption, a world of corruption. I just wanted to perhaps talk about this matter further, but I would like to say lastly that Islam protects the rights of laborers through entrenching their values, because the government cannot follow the nitty-gritty of the matter. If a maid is at home and a worker at a shop or at a plant, the government cannot follow all the nuances. God can see everything, and indeed this is the value of beneficence and piety. Beneficence or ihsan, the Prophet said, if you are muhsin or if you are carry out beneficence, you need to work for the sake of God, and you need to fear God, and you need to work for God as if you see Him Almighty. If you do something wrong, you need to be watched by God, even if you are on your own without anybody around you. If you do not see God, if you do not have this conscience, then you will be heading into problems. One mother in the tradition of the Prophet, one of the books said that a mother was encouraging her daughter to deceive people, and the daughter used to say no. The mother used to say to the daughter that you fear Omar, don't you? No, the daughter said, no, I fear God, I don't fear any human being. So I need to look at my conscience, I need to see God overseeing everything I do. And those who converted to Islam, by God, they have done so following a role model. They cannot be converted by force or by power. Al-Jarudi talked about his story in the Qatar University. He said, I followed Islam because I watched one French Muslim soldier and his conduct. Another story talks about similar issues. A woman was converted to Islam because she followed another role model, because she had a neighbor who was a Muslim who was very good to her. So indeed, if we follow the ethics, then we can reach success.
And the same applies to the rights of migrant workers, and these rights have been regulated. And the components of the different contracts, these contractual relations are relations that are based on ethics. And we in Islam, when it comes to the rights of the contracted, is not, part of the relations between people. It is regulated by ethics and morals, and the economy of the market used to be regulated by display and demand. But this kind of rule, which is the rule of demand and display, could not and was not able to protect the right of migrant workers. And after that, the workers took to the street, and also we have seen a change in capitalism, and we have seen the establishment of trade unions. These things have all been regulated by Islam a long time back. I only started understanding these things when I started reading about contracts and how Islam regulated the contractual relations between workers and employers. What is the position of Islam? Very briefly, what is the position of Islam? We are against any oppression that is exercised on any person. Islam is against that, and God would not be in favor or blessing any works or acts of worship that entail of transactions, that include acts of oppression or injustice. If there are certain behaviors in the GCC countries, these are not general, these are only individual cases. Most GCC Arabs, Muslims, most human beings do not strive to exercise injustices. I really liked one of the interventions who said that many Indian workers died, and when we try to compare the number of Indians in Qatar and the number of those who die in India, we have found that the number of people who die in India are tenfold when you compare. So many accusations and criticism is politicized. So many countries, they try to target another country for politicized reasons. Yes, we would like to have reform. We want to have the dissemination of Islamic value, but we do not want to have any interference that is politicized or some covert reasons. Yes, we would like to thank, and in the name of the Islamic Union of Muslim Scholars, we have thanked Germany, we have thanked ranked all countries. But now, very frankly, the West is moving towards a kind of a system which is the system of kafala or selectivity. It doesn't mean that we accept this system. Yes, there should be restrictions that should entail the respect of the rights of our workers in keeping with Sharia law. We should not be reactive neither to the workers nor to any other party. We have our principles. We have to learn from other people's experiences. And as the prophetic tradition says that wisdom is the path that should be followed by Muslims, there are so many things that I really want to say, but I'm going to stop here, and may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Qaradaghi. Now I will call on Dr. Syed, Jawad Syed, to give his presentation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to, in particular, thank Dr. Sheikh Qaradaghi for an enlightened and egalitarian approach to Islam and also the rights of workers, including migrant workers. And indeed, these are the insights which are much needed, not only in one country or in Muslim majority countries, but across all countries. As I was explaining in one of my talks this morning, which was part of the seminar, that the issue of human rights and the issue of migrant rights is not an issue of Islam versus West or Arab versus West. My previous studies, my previous research has been pertaining to the issues and challenges facing Muslim migrant women in Australia and Muslim workers in the UK. And now that I have focused my attention on migrant workers in the Middle East, particularly female domestic workers, migrant workers in Qatar, I can clearly see that there are issues which are similar. There is some similarity. So it's not either or it's not something versus the other. Our issues are common, our challenges are common, and therefore perhaps we need to find resolution in solidarity. As Dr. Tariq Ramadan explained in the introduction, that there are two possibilities when we look at the issues of human rights and migrant rights. And those two possibilities are either to look at from a textual perspective or to look at it from a contextual perspective. So for example, Sheikh Qaradaghi presented a textual perspective, whereas my perspective would be more contextual based on, I do not have much time. I have already been alerted very strictly by Reda that I do not have to violate the time limits. So indeed, I will be only presenting one example, but there are numerous examples. I must also confess that I'm also acting as a bad cop here in this panel. So the description which I will be presenting may be a little bit, if you call it, problematic and disturbing. So what exactly, coming from an, if you call it, a management school perspective and academic perspective, what exactly is the lens that I am using when I look at female domestic workers in Qatar? What exactly is the lens? I'm using two lenses. One lens is that of Islamic diversity. I will explain in a bit what exactly is it. And the other lens is intersectionality. So let me explain the lens of Islamic diversity. That lens basically is an acknowledgement that although Islam is one religion and Quran is one book and Prophet Muhammad is one prophet, but nevertheless, Muslims themselves, they are not monolith. There is so much heterogeneity in terms of ethnicities, in terms of interpretations, in terms of practices. Indeed, there should be an acknowledgement, and there is an acknowledgement that Islamic normative ideals may not necessarily reflect in actual Muslim practices. So for example, the textual presentation which was presented to you by the previous speaker, part of it might be reflected in actual practices, but part of it may be hypothetical. So the normative ideals may not always necessarily match with what exactly is happening in our societies. And indeed, as I already explained, that there is heterogeneity of interpretations and practices. So for example, the way migrant workers or female domestic workers, for example, they are being treated in Turkey would be different from, somewhat different from the way they are being treated here in Qatar, vis-a-vis, for example, they are being treated in other countries. There is also an issue of voice that, for example, when we are talking about a specific community, to what extent are we making an effort to engage with that specific group? And so that we do not overlay our voice upon their voice. Yes, we can be suggestive, we can offer certain recommendations, but at the same time, we have to make an effort to engage with them, to see what exactly are they going to offer in terms of their own perspectives. In terms of intersectionality, I will very briefly explain that the notion of intersectionality, it takes into account that we have multiple identities. So for example, women, they belong to one category, but is that categorization sufficient? Does that capture the heterogeneity of experiences? For example, we might have women who are, if you call it indigenous Qatari. We might have women who might be from Lebanon, but they are in white-collar or top-class jobs in Qatar. Vis-a-vis, we might have other women who are working as low-class, unskilled, domestic working women in families, in private houses. So are there issues similar, or are there issues and challenges they are heterogeneous? So that is what intersectionality looks into. It looks into the intersection of gender with ethnicity, with nationality, with religion, and so on and so forth. So let's move towards the key issues. What exactly are the key issues facing female migrant workers, not only in Qatar, but across the world? And when I say across the world, I also include some of the developed countries. So once again, I must emphasize, it's not a criticism of Qatar, it's not a criticism of Muslim majority countries or Arab countries. Unfortunately, these issues are common across continents and countries. So there are two major issues which have been identified in the literature. First is an overwhelming majority of international female migrants, they belong to either low-skilled or semi-skilled category. So that is one major element which we identify in the literature. And the second element, which is rather sad and disturbing, is there are reports of vulnerability and abuse of female migrant workers, which are then shaping the debate. Some of them are very highly politicized, and some of them are exaggerated. But at the same time, some of them are really substantive. At least there is some core to it. So those issues are shaping the debates over justice and human rights, both at the national and international levels. So where exactly is Qatar in terms of migrant workers, and why, what exactly is the magnitude of this community or group that we are dealing with? So we know that Qatar has a population of approximately 2 million inhabitants, 86% of which they happen to be foreign workers or their dependents. And they belong to mostly these 5 countries: India, Nepal, the Philippines, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. In terms of immigrants as percentage of total population, Qatar tops the list of immigrant destination countries in the world. So further statistics I will be offering with you. According to the 2010 Qatar census, 132,000, more than that, foreign nationals. Including 84,000 women and 48,000 men, they are employed in the domestic work sector. So the majority, the dominant majority of those who are working in the domestic work sector, they happen to be women. These figures include people who are working in various professions. And according to a 2014 estimate, there are approximately 30,000 women from Philippines. They are working as domestic workers in Qatar, while around 20,000 female, they are of the Indonesian origin. So what exactly is the normal uptake of a female domestic worker by Qatari families? Typically around 2. So typically a Qatari family would be hiring around 2 female domestic workers and a male domestic worker as a driver. So I will be cutting short my presentation, but only to give you an overview that there are multi-level issues of vulnerability which have been identified. In my critical review, I was able to, I must confess that so far there has not been statistical or quantitative study conducted on the situation of female domestic workers in Qatar. And part of it is also to be explained that there is no official statistics. There are no official statistics available. So there is perhaps an opportunity for the government officials to monitor it, because if something is monitored, it can be managed better. Nevertheless, when I reviewed three types of resources. One were the reports by rights groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. That was one resource which I studied. The other resource was the academic research. For example, some of the studies have been conducted by Ray, sitting on my right-hand side, and some of the studies have been conducted by other scholars about the GCC countries, and also some studies are particularly focused on migrant workers in Qatar. So those were that was my second resource, and my third resource was the media reports, because sometimes the media reports are also, they are useful, sometimes they are not captured. So I used these three resources, and I was able to identify three key dimensions of multi-level vulnerability which is facing female domestic workers in Qatar. So first is their social poverty. They are socially isolated, and that is also by virtue of their employment, because most of the times, if not all the times, they are confined to the families or to the houses where they work. Sometimes their situation is more precarious than that. They are locked in the houses. I don't say in the majority of cases, maybe in a tiny minority, but that is what has been reported. The second thing is that there are excessive powers which are available to their employer. Their employer usually happen to be, which is another unfortunate reality. It happens to be usually a woman, the housewife. So that is also something which has been reported, that in the majority of cases it is the housewife who at times is misusing the powers available to her. And the third element which is identified in the literature is that there is a legal system in Qatar which is simply not designed to help female, not even female, domestic migrant workers. So domestic workers, they are not covered by the labor law in Qatar and many other countries. So Qatar is not an exception here. But that doesn't mean that the reforms are not possible. The idea is this, that these issues have been highlighted with the hope that perhaps at some level, for example, at the level of Islamic scholars, at the level of, for example, rights groups of the governments, government departments, academic research, there will be more attention to this so that the situation could be reformed. Let me give you only one, if you call it, snapshot of female domestic worker. I've got many examples. As I said, that the three types of resources which I gleaned, I have a number of examples, but due to scarcity of time, I will only share one with you. This was a case which drew my attention only after Ray invited me to this seminar a few months ago. And at that time when I was collecting data and doing some analysis, this case in particular captured my attention. It has not yet been captured in academic research, but it made a lot of publicity in the social media and also the mainstream media. It was also reported by a local newspaper, which is the Doha News. So the case relates to an Indonesian woman, 25 years old. This was reported back in April 2015, so it's quite fresh. She was hospitalized for more than 3 days following a beating by her employer that left her with multiple injuries. So the account, and I have to read it word by word so that I don't overlay my voice on it. The account says that she fled her sponsor's home after being beaten with the metal end of a hose used to siphon water. She ran to a neighboring house where a domestic worker allowed her to come inside. The friend then called the police, who upon seeing the victim called an ambulance. She was taken to a public hospital and received 6 stitches to close a gash on her skull, as well as treatment for a broken wrist. So this was the media story, but what exactly are her own words? Let's listen to her own words. And she says, initially, he just slapped or reprimanded me. It wasn't bad, but then it started getting worse. He says, I annoy him because I'm slow, so he does it. The children have told him that I hit them, but I don't, and so he hits me. Once again, I must emphasize that I'm not claiming that this is the situation with the majority of female domestic workers in Qatar. Perhaps it's a situation with a tiny minority. But nevertheless, these cases and similar cases have been reported in various outlets. So this means, particularly, the situation becomes more precarious when we realize that domestic workers do not have protection under the labor law. So then this gives us an opportunity and gives the government an opportunity to think about it, that there are issues which need to be tackled. And indeed, as Sheikh Qaradaghi said, that these cases are not consistent with the Islamic principles of justice, Islamic principles of charity, Islamic principles of humanity. So if there is a violation, indeed there is a violation of Islamic principles, and there is a violation of International Charter of Human Rights, and there is a violation of the conventions on the rights of domestic workers, then perhaps there is also an opportunity for the government to intervene. In the end, I would only be sharing with you 2 very interesting examples from Islamic history, which are relevant to the case of domestic workers and how they ought to be treated. One example relates to Prophet Muhammad's own daughter, Lady Fatima. And it's a worthy example. She had a work arrangement with her housemaid. Her housemaid was originally from Abyssinia, Habasha. Her name was Fizza. So Lady Fatima had a work arrangement with Fizza in a manner that one day she used to work and the other day Fizza used to work. So that's how they used to distribute the house chores, and that's how they also had to have the sufficient rest period. The other example, once again from Islamic history, of humane treatment of personal servant, it comes from the 2nd Caliph Umar. When Caliph Umar left for Jerusalem from Medina, he had only 1 attendant with him and only 1 camel to ride. Umar and the attendant rode the camel by turns. It happened to be the servant's turn to ride on the day when they were to approach Jerusalem. The attendant said, I give up my turn. It would look very awkward that you, the Caliph of Islam, is entering Jerusalem and you are leading the camel and I'm riding the camel. But Umar said, no, I'm not going to be unjust. The honor of Islam is enough for us all. So in the end, I conclude with only this observation that at the governmental level, also at the academic level, we need to take into account the intersectionality of gender, with various forms of identity, including migration, including ethnicity, including face, and so on and so forth. And once we develop an intersectional perspective, then there is a hope that perhaps reforms for gender equality will also look at those women who happen to be invisible and who happen to be the other women. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. That was a very a good overview of what is occurring. Finally, and we're really running out of time, so without further ado, Mr. Jabir, would you please address?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
All blessings be to our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Dr. Ali bin Smekh al-Marri, I would like to convey his salute, his greetings. He wanted to participate with you, but because he participates in another conference on the 15th and the 16th that relates to the American-Liberian Arab dialogue, he was preoccupied and he mandated me to give you an invitation to participate in this conference and to greet you, to welcome you in Qatar. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like on my behalf and on behalf of the National Committee of Human Rights in Qatar to extend our gratitude to His Excellency Dr. Tariq Ramadan, the head of CILE, for his invitation, and we hope for him and for the CILE to progress. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, human rights by and large, and the labor migrants in particular, has become the hot potato in our life. And this relates to the relationship thereby with the humans, as humans are the first beneficiaries of the human rights issues, and thus he or she ought to participate in propagating this awareness vis-à-vis human rights locally, regionally, and internationally. We at the committee believe that the labor's rights ought not to be standards or texts. They ought to be applied on the ground. Respect of the dignity of humans ought to be part and parcel of our conduct, our culture, so that every human can live with dignity and liberate himself from fear and penury in an environment that is conducive to security and development. In light of believing that every person ought to take care of himself or herself, and or otherwise humans ought to extend the bridges with the others, and the workers ought not to lose their freedoms for the piece of bread. They need to live with dignity. Humans are the only creatures that the angels were ordered to supplicate for him. In the Quran, it says, if I ensoul the humans, angels, you ought to supplicate for him. So indeed, we need to tackle the matter in a very wise manner. We need to also extend our gratitude to those in charge of this symposium that allows us to have an overlook at the workers in Qatar. Indeed, this is a very important phenomenon, and the government spares no time in entrenching the rights of the workers. But at the same time, there are legislations that restrict some of the rights of the workers, and they need to be reformed, on the top of which the system of sponsorship, as well as the exclusion of the maids and the domestic workers. There is an international law that ought to be taken into consideration, and here we would like to look at some of the international standards, and then we will be tackling the issue on the ground. Humans migration from one place to another is an ancient story. The environment and the livelihood of humans compelled them to move from one place to another. Earthquakes, floods, droughts, and the outbreak of diseases, wars, especially the intestine wars, compelled humans to move from the country of origin to another countries. Migration for work and to improve the livelihood, as well as investing, as we call it, the economic migration. This is a contemporary phenomenon. The regulation of this migration is also a contemporary one. The preamble of the constitution of the Howaiel, which was established in 1919, it stipulates the protection of the migrants who work in a different country. Nationally speaking, the legal framework had texts whereby the migrants are included in such codifications of such laws, and the relationship thereby with the government has been organized. The migration has been steadfast, and indeed bilateral agreements took place in order to protect the workers and not to lead them astray, as well as to protect the national security of the destination country. In addition to lay off the exploitation of workers. Bilateral agreements, as I said, organize the relationship between the country of origin and the country of destination. There were different legal frameworks vis-à-vis migration. Conventions, bilateral agreements were expanded to become regional agreements to organize the migration between the countries. And lastly, the legal framework has been advanced and progressed. Indeed, the international law is the central plank of such organization. The United Nations is the watchdog of such law, as well as the affiliated organizations like the IOL and the International Convention on the Protection of the Migrants and the Laborers is one convention of the other conventions that deal with such matter. The international conventions took heed of the workers, especially within the vicinity of the United Nations, as well as the Nations League in 1919. And hundreds of instruments saw the light to entrench such rights. There is, for example, the Convention number 97, as well as the promotion of the equal opportunities, the provision of equal opportunities, as well as the 1930 Convention, as well as the abolishment of forced work in another year, as well as the conventions that deal with trade unions, number 898, as well as the freedom of trade unions and the protection of the trade unions work in another year. We had as well a political convention in 1964, 122, and the other recommendations that deal with the labor migrants. There are also a number of conventions that were established, like the one on slavery, which was taken place in 1926, as well as the other annexes of the same convention that abolished slavery in Geneva on the 7th of September in 1956 and took force in April in 1957, as well as the other convention that was adopted in 1938 and took force in May in 1932, as well as the International Convention on the Protection of the Migrants and their Families in 1979, which took force in 2003. There are also the international conventions on the migrants' rights and their families, and it deals with 4 axes. First, the comprehensive convention that covers the protection of the workers and the right to work, as well as the right to health, accommodation, and work. And it includes also the legal and the illegal migrants, as well as their families, and it applies to all migrants without taking into consideration the residence or the timeline of the stay. This convention depends on the principles that related to the original instruments that dealt with human rights, as well as the other principles of the relevant instruments within the framework of the IOL. The convention in its preamble has alluded to the fact that the objective of the IOL, in accordance with its constitution, is to do with the preservation of the interest of the migration when they work abroad. The United Nations has took heed of the size of the migration phenomenon. It affects all the countries across the globe. The United Nations has took heed of the impact of the influx of migrations and also took into consideration the vulnerability of the migrants and their families because of certain reasons like being away from the country of origin and also the obstacles they face on their journey. The rights of the immigrants were acknowledged in certain countries and not acknowledged in others. Immigration might resemble a problem for a number of reasons, as well as for the migrants themselves, because of the disintegration of the family. What I mean by the family is those who are married from the migrants, as well as the children and the other dependents. The convention has organized the different rights, especially the rights of staving off torment and staving off any punishment or any inhumane treatment, as well as torture, and emphasized the personal security, and it worded off also enslavement, and it emphasized the remuneration, as well as staving off the forceful detention and the right to compensation. And indeed, if there was a trial, there ought to be guarantees for the workers and not putting him or her behind the bars because of the violation of certain contract, and to treat them on a par with the subjects of the country of destination in accordance with the remuneration and wages, as well as the participation in the trade unions, as well as the right of the reunion and the protection from dismissal, as well as the right of having alternative work when they become redundant in return of having a mechanism in place in order to apply the convention on the ground.
The different organizations and also the different conventions that aim to protect the rights of workers and their families, they all say that countries have the right to give priority to their own citizenship when it comes to job opportunities, and also to devise certain policies that give the right or opportunities to citizens at the expense of other workers. It has the right also to give distinctive services to its citizenship and also to give free education to its citizenship. But it is not acceptable to discriminate against the foreign workers when it comes to the different legal services and also the circumstances at work, because all conventions, international conventions, underline that we have to develop local legislations for them to be in harmony with the different criteria of human rights and international conventions. The position of the National Human Rights Committee in the state of Qatar, the National Human Rights Committee says that Qatar should try to accede to all conventions pertaining to the rights of migrant workers, and also we have to specify what we mean by migrant workers, those who leave their own countries to work for a temporary period of time in other countries, countries of destinations. And that is not going to, there is no harm or any threat to the countries acceding to the conventions, because this is not going to be inimical to the demographic makeup of the country. And there are a number of recommendations from the National Committee, Human Rights Committee. We have to have a national plan to protect and reinforce human rights when it comes to migrant workers. all ministries and agencies should be supportive of this plan, and we have also to try to rectify all national legislations in keeping with international conventions. We have to activate the role of civil society and also to have associations that would be protective of the rights of the migrant workers, also to have continuous process of training and development that should include all employees, all those who are in charge of law enforcement and all stakeholders. Also, we have to have legislations to protect the rights of workers at home and also the workers on the ground, and also the protection of women and children, and also the right of family to be unified and not to separate children from their parents, and also to guarantee the cultural and financial and economic rights of workers, and also to underline the importance of these workers because they contribute to the economy of the state. And also we have to respect the particularities, social and economic and cultural particularities of the state, and also the legislations should be in keeping with international conventions of human rights and also the rights of migrant workers in general. And may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to have your perspective. I should add that the National Human Rights Committee in Qatar is possibly the most active organization in providing assistance to migrant workers in crisis or in trouble, with regular community representatives being invited to the committee to discuss various issues. And also providing legal aid to migrant workers who need their assistance. I'm afraid we have taken up most of the time, or pretty much all of the time, in fact. But if you're willing to stay on some longer, and if I could ask the permission of the panelists to stay a little longer in order that we can have a discussion, that we can have some questions from the audience. But if you, I would like to restrict it to questions to the panelists and to keep it brief rather than making statements, because we really do not have a lot of time. I don't know actually if we're going to be asked to leave at some point, but we'll stay for as long as we can in order to allow more audience participation. But before that, I would ask you to join me in thanking the panelists and the speakers who've given their time and wonderful presentations this evening. Thank you very much. So, please just raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, and please introduce yourself as you do so. And if you want to specify a question to a particular speaker, feel welcome to do so. Please.
The crisis of refugees in Arab region is not the first. We have two antecedents, Palestinian and Iraqis. And what is happening now, it's in the continuity of the Arab city regarding the refugees. في نقاش اتفاقية
In the discussion of the Convention on the Refugees in 1951, Luis Massinio, when he was invited to the discussion, he emphasized the Aman, the pledge of protection and security for others. It is actually the central plank of the convention. Luis Massinio based this on two observations: his experience in Iraq and the protection of the Syrians, of the Armenians in southern Syria. And thus the convention that the most Arab countries did not accede to, one of its central plank is to do with the...
I think that the legal reform are important, but have to be improved with social change. But also, we need that regional perspective. Qatar, UAE, Kuwait are in the regional system. And now what we see that the absence of regional perspective in dealing with migration and refugees in GCC, but also in Arab region, make this international issue more and more complicated. At the opposite, in the last two weeks, we've seen a different minister meeting in Europe, in different countries, dealing and trying to resolve this issue. And in Arab region, always one state is think that he is more able to resolve migration issue or refugee. I think that if we have to think or rethink, we have to be more not general but open and have a national cross the border. The border are not always. I know. I think that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Interior need to respect the border, but in resolving our thinking, what said our colleague from London, I don't think that the newspaper in the GCC can be the best source. We know that what newspaper in Arab country, how they deal with this sensitive issue. Shukran.
Thank you very much. I'll take a few questions rather than answering one at a time. Yes, the lady.
Just have a really quick question, and I think it might even be a simple one. So a lot of initiatives are underway at the political level to help address the magnitude of issues with migrant workers in Qatar and in other countries. As the first gentleman said, it's a global issue. It's not one person or one country. I'm wondering what we can do as individuals on a daily basis, as just average people, to help in any capacity, be it charity and volunteering, contributing money, whatever. What can we do, each and every one of us as individuals today, before the end of 2016, when some of the new things might come through?
Good question, thank you. Yes. Can you just pass it below? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I had a question to Dr. Jawad Syed. You started your speech by explaining that the issues in Qatar, in the Gulf region, are somehow similar to other countries in the world. I would like to know what are the similarities and how those similarities have been tackled elsewhere to basically come up with a solution or solutions.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أنا محمد. راح أحكي بالعربي. النقطة الأولى اللي عاوز highlighted هي موضوع مثلا المنطقة الصناعية.
The first point that I wanted to highlight is to do with the industrial zone in Qatar. Perhaps hundreds of thousands of bachelors live in there, and they are perhaps they cannot go to their country of origin in accordance with the contract of the migrants here. This resembles a problem, and this has been the main reason of gayishness and homosexuality in that area. Perhaps we need to look at this matter and look at the contracts ratified in the Gulf and the social implications of such contracts. We need to focus on this issue so that we can be careful when we pass laws and abolish certain other nuances. This is a point that might be raised, that might be taken into consideration. The other point, the Sheikh, the doctor, Al-Qaradaghi, I do not know what is the perspective of Islam vis-à-vis the open-ended contracts. The latest amendment of the draft labor law in Qatar has made the open-ended contract void, and indeed these kind of contracts ought to be taken into consideration. Most of the contracts are open-ended, to be honest, and it's not confined to 1 year or 2 years. Any person who wants, or if an employer wanted a year before the termination of the contract, he can give a notice to the laborer to go back home. So what is the Islamic perspective vis-à-vis the open-ended contract, and so that we can include them in the draft law? I would like to thank Dr. Jawad for shedding the light on the migration issue. If we talk about the Syrian migration nowadays, everybody knows that Syria was a hub, a Mecca for a number of refugees, but now it is vice versa. The Syrians are fleeing their own country, as well as the labor propelled kind of migrations. There was a document that talks about Somalia's fundraising to help Saudi Arabia, but now Somalia is suffering economically, and Saudi Arabia is better.
هذه الأيام نداولها بين الناس، الكفة تنقلب من جهة أخرى. شكرا لكم.
Okay, let's stop there and allow some responses from our panelists.
Thank you, Ray, and thanks to the participants. The first question which was asked was about the newspaper item. Yes, you're right, that newspaper items at times can be can reflect something which is not there. But in this specific case, the item which was selected was in line with the other reports, so it was not an outlier. So for example, a similar item could have been reproduced from the reports from an academic thesis or from the rights groups reports. So it was not an outlier. So that was more consistent. My impression was that since we are in a media savvy kind of era, and everybody has the smart telephones, some of them might connect with the case. So that was the only explanation. Coming back to the other question, which the lady there asked me, that the similarities, what are the similarities between issues facing migrant workers here in Qatar or in the GCC vis-a-vis the issues they face in Western countries. I will try to keep my answer brief, but usually I use a relational lens, a multi-level lens, when I investigate their issues. So for example, when I investigated issues and challenges facing migrant women in Australia, I used a relational lens, which is by Bourdieu, a sociologist. And the idea is that we look at the macro-national challenges, the organizational or the meso-level challenges, and the micro-individual challenges. Very briefly, at the macro-national level, we look at the legal and cultural and the socio-economic challenges facing the specific community that we are investigating. At the organizational level, we look at the organizational interventions, what kind of resources are being offered by the organization in order to accommodate, to be inclusive for that specific community or group. And at the individual level, we look at the issues of individual identity, intersectionality, and also the issue of agency and the unique resourcefulness. Apparently, these issues also apply to the case of migrant workers in Qatar. Of course, the extent will be different, perhaps the expression will be different, but the issues remain multi-level, as I'm sure that I very cursorily tried to explain this evening, that the issues which are currently facing the migrant women, female domestic workers in Qatar, they are at multiple levels. So they are not only at the macro-national level, for example, at the legal level and the cultural level, but also at the level of the organization. Here I'm not referring to formal organization. I'm referring to the informal employer, the actual, the housewife who is employing them. And at the individual level, indeed, the issues and challenges facing them, they are different. And they are also differentiated on the basis of their nationality and their legal status. So for example, I'm sure that if I'm assuming that you have spent, you live in Qatar, then I'm sure you will be aware that there is a hierarchy of domestic workers. Some of them get more paid than others. So those hierarchies are there, which is once again, which refers to the issue of intersectionality at the micro-individual level.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Mohammed has posed a question, and he said that there are some workers who are banned from returning to their own country. Any person who lives in Qatar, no one can ban him or her from returning to their country, regardless of the status of such person. However, if you could allow me, we deal with the matter in a level-headed way. If we have a worker who wants to leave to his country of origin, then we liaise with his sponsor, with his kafil, and our stance will be fair and neutral. And we ask the person to clarify the reasons of such ban on his travel. If there were legal reasons for this person not to be traveling or going back, perhaps he might have been indebted. And if he would leave, then the debt wouldn't be paid, and this will affect the company. However, our stance, as I said, is neutral. If he has no justification to ban this person, the Ministry of Interior will participate in issuing the exit permit for such person without the agreement of the employer. Indeed, we have a hotline, and all the governmental organizations work diligently to have this issue being dealt with fairly. As a matter of fact, I would like to thank my dear sister for her emotions. And everybody needs to feel compassionate with his fellow humans. I would like to thank you wholeheartedly. And indeed, some of the Western countries were indeed humane. And we have blamed some of the Arab countries that shirked their responsibilities. We call the names as they are. We call the spade spade. And when it comes to what Mr. Mohammed has said, the open-ended contracts ought to be fair, or the contracts ought to be fair. As they say, when it comes to the contracts, pacta sunt servanda. So these contracts can be renewed automatically in 2 years' time, or it can be open-ended. No person has the right to dismiss the employer. But Islamically speaking, the contracts ought to be level-headed. Thank you very much. I would like to thank CILE. I would like to thank CILE for this peculiar and distinguished symposium.
Just before you speak, can I just add one thing to that last issue? The open-ended contract, that is, that it says that there is no specified time period for the contract. That we have an indication of what that means by the reform proposal at the moment, that the changing of the employer, if you have an open-ended contract, it will be allowed after 5 years. So there is at least an implicit understanding that open-ended contracts have a 5-year period. But the labour law makes it very, very clear what kind of notice, how much notice, a month's notice, for the different types of contracts are all specified in the labour law. The question is whether the workers know about that. That's another issue, but they do have rights for redress if they are not being allowed an exit visa. And one other correction, it may have been a translation issue, I'm not sure, but these are not bachelors. It was I don't know if you said single, and it was translated as bachelor. In fact, over 70%, around 75% of these men are in fact married with dependent children. So they are not single men, they are in fact family men who are here working to support their families back home. And the problem is that they cannot bring their families to Qatar unless they have a minimum salary of 10,000 riyals per month, which basically is prohibitive for the vast majority of workers, particularly in the construction sector and services. Latife, please.
Very quickly to answer your question about what we can do as regular people to improve the situation or to at least raise awareness, because I've seen from my experience working as a consultant with organizations that try to that basically focus on lobbying and collaborating with the ministries, the relevant ministers in Lebanon specifically. I'm just giving the example of Lebanon, is that the civil society actually is much more active in raising awareness and in this particular, and for example, in the situation of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon, than experts and officials of organizations are in trying to pass a change in the law with our current labor minister, for example, or the Ministry of Justice, so this kind of collaboration is often more lengthy, more difficult. I don't know if civil society can, I am not sure if the civil society efforts can contribute to long-term or sustainable improvement of the situation of migrant domestic workers. But for example, small groups of people, not necessarily have to be formally organized, have, for example, tried to change the attitudes that are often very racist when it comes to domestic work in Lebanon, because of the stigma of domestic work, which is an issue basically, and that is usually very wrongly associated with nationalities and with race and color and citizenship in general. So it's maybe looking into what people have done, for example, bringing domestic workers from Ethiopia, Sri Lanka to markets, food markets, and display their food. For example, this is something that regular people just organized. They invited domestic workers to come and give their food. They said, and sell their food, just to get acquainted with the culture and meet in different contexts in society. So for example, these small initiatives have an impact. Some people, I think the majority of people would react positively to them. I've heard from some colleagues that people did not want to eat the food that domestic workers were serving, but I don't know. They don't have any. These were kind of rumors. I don't think in this food market, which is a lively event, a social event that regular people attend, people are going to be rude towards somebody who's selling his food in the same, in the same place. So I think there are many examples of things, small things that people can do to raise awareness, and I think they are quite effective. And I think sometimes when we look at the way the community, when we appeal to the emotions or to the respect for basic rights, for things that feel right, not necessarily for rights as in, you know, kind of in legal terms, but as things that feel good, that feel right, that something that feels right, then people would react to it positively. So as long as there is a message in creative ways of engaging, you know, the society with these issues, and that do not necessarily have to be direct, you know, or that do not necessarily have to discuss law, I think they're important. And usually in Lebanon, people get very creative in this sense. There are lots of groups doing things, at least in terms of the situation of domestic workers, migrant domestic workers in Lebanon.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've extended the time enough. I don't know if we can afford the overtime of the translators that we've demanded of them, and I wish to thank them very much for all of their assistance during this lecture. I want to thank you all for your attendance and the panelists for their presentations. I want to thank CILE staff for the organization and assistance in setting up this lecture. And thank you very much for coming. And I wish you all good night. Thank you.